Hey VC, this is a video response to MeanMrMayo's Beatles favorite Beatles and solo projects video contest. This is my second or third time making this. First time I tried it via YouTube's upload function, and I worked on it, and then it paused and was stopped, and I restarted it. And then when I was about to save it, it just suddenly was gone. And I wasn't going to do it, but then I saw other people's contributions, and it's such a fun and interesting subject since, like a lot of us, the Beatles are sort of a gateway into lots of other different kinds of music. They're one of the first things a lot of people find out about because they're, the biggest band ever, basically. And I'm repeating myself, but you won't have heard the other ones, so... Anyway, it's interesting to follow along the trajectory of the Beatles' songwriting abilities and musical experimentation. Their early pop songs are sort of straightforward as far as the musicality of them in some ways. Then they start getting into interesting things like feedback and reverse guitars and sampling interesting things like radio and some interesting orchestrations, etc. And one thing I feel strongly about is that the Beatles are sort of bigger than the sum of their individual parts. I feel like none of their solo projects, in some respects, stand up to the Beatles records, with maybe one exception for me. And I lean heavily in the John Lennon side of things. Paul, I feel like his best work was definitely with the Beatles. Same more or less with George Harrison. And I really think that George Martin had a huge impact on the way the Beatles sounded and really encouraged them to do some interesting things. He had worked with I think Peter Sellers and the Goon, I forget what they called, the Goon Squad or something, but then he is also a classical music producer, so he was able to introduce the Beatles to some really interesting stuff that if they had some typical producer of that time, they probably wouldn't have picked up those influences, so I think that influence can't be overstated. But anyway, if I was going to list my favorite 5 Beatles and solo projects, starting with number 5, although it's really hard to say. I'm going to start with Revolver. I just have the American issue because that's what I grew up with. This isn't the one that I grew up with because that had been my dad's. I don't know where I got this particular copy. Maybe it is my dad's. I don't know. As you can see, it's sort of well worn. I don't mind that so much with something like this that, is sort of a staple of growing up. It would be weird to have a pristine copy of this almost. My favorite tracks, well, first of all, I think it's a great record. Some really interesting sounds. One of the things I like about the Beatles versus their solo projects is I feel like the sounds they came up with were so much more interesting when they were with the Beatles. Taxman, those guitars, and just the way it starts off with a 1, 2. Anyway, it's really neat. Eleanor Rigby is just about my favorite of Paul's songs. It's just such a haunting, beautiful song. Very sad. We don't want to be Eleanor Rigby, but there's a part of Eleanor Rigby in all of us, which is why it's so relatable. Love You Too is a really amazing song from George, where he's getting into his Eastern influences. Each day just goes so fast. It's who can't relate to that. She Said, John going in some interesting directions there with that, and obviously so John ends both sides, at least in the American release, with a really interesting sort of psychedelic song. She Said on side A, and Tomorrow Never Knows, which is my favorite song on the album, one of my absolute favorite Beatles songs. Turn off your mind, relax, and float down the street. Anyway, amazing. Love this album. My second favorite, well, not second favorite. My next one on the list is going to be the Beatles' White Album. Came after Revolver. I'm trying to think if Revolver, then Sgt. Pepper, then this. Anyway, most of this was composed around the time that they were having their little interlude with the Maharishi in India. They were going through a lot of songwriting then, and it's just an amazing double album. I mean, so often double albums I think are filled with all kinds of filler or noodling around that doesn't really necessarily amount to much. I don't think that's so with this at all. I especially love John's contributions here. I like some of Paul's stuff, but then some of Paul's stuff is just the sing-songy stuff. Like a song that I liked a lot as a child that doesn't do so much for me now is Rocky Raccoon. That's like you can almost imagine a cartoon that goes along with that. So like Paul's songs that I don't know, I just don't find them that sophisticated, I guess, in a certain way. I love Back in the USSR, for example. That just has just such a great rockin' sound. Dear Prudence is so beautiful. Happiness is a Warm Gun is a great commentary on the United States at this point, it seems like. I'm So Tired. It's neat that Paul really let it all go as far as he could take it with Helter Skelter. And then it's just such a really interesting transition. I love it when an album takes you through sort of an emotional roller coaster of moods and ambience, which I really feel like you get with this, from Sexy Sadie to Helter Skelter and then into Long, Long, Long. If you're listening to this, a lot of times I like to try to listen to music in the dark with headphones and just give it my full focus. And of course your brain is going off in its own direction as it's triggered by things you're picking up in the songs. But Long, Long, Long is just so like slipping into a different level of dream state when that song comes in, it seems to me. And then Revolution. Revolution 9 is one of my absolute favorite Beatles tracks. It's not a typical song by any means. I wish I could find whole albums that sounded like Revolution 9. And a friend of mine one time lent me a CD of something that was into that kind of sound experiment. I find it just so interesting to sort of drift through that, almost like a stream of consciousness experiment. And then it's neat the way it goes from that into Good Night, which is, again, it takes you into this different mood. Listening to that late at night in my teenage formative years, listening to Revolution 9 and being sort of frightened by it. It's like going through a scary dream and then into a more comforting dream with Good Night. And then maybe listening to that and going to sleep. Anyway, this isn't the copy that I used to have, unfortunately. As I've said in my other videos, over the years, due to financial straits and space and upgrading to CDs over the years with various things, I lost or made bad decisions about my vinyl collection. I, of course, had an original edition with the serial number and with the posters and stuff. Actually, I still have the poster with this, which is nice, and the pictures, rather. And my most prized one, I had a white vinyl Apple label copy of this, which I'm just heartbroken not to have anymore. Okay, next thing is something that people who are familiar with the Beatles might still not be that aware of, and that is this. This is a compilation of the Beatles' Christmas singles that they did for their fan club. This is a really fascinating, sort of oddity, rarity, whatever you want to call it, for the Beatles. If you're a Beatles fan and you haven't heard this, do yourself a favor and check this out, because this is really great. It starts off as maybe typical fan club kinds of records, where it's like just them thanking the fans for their good year from 1963, doing sort of shout outs to their fans and talking about what they have going on, to, as it goes on, you go through again some of the changes that the Beatles themselves are going through. You hear that in how they handle these fan records. At first, they're doing something just so typical, then obviously they're getting a little bored with it and wanting to sort of be a little bit more off the wall. by the end they're doing these really fabulous, interesting skits that I don't know. I just find really interesting and fun. But they're 1963 through 1969, so that's quite a period of time to sort of hear them change from year to year, Christmas to Christmas, and it's just a really fun thing. I don't know if this is really a bootleg. I think this is probably some kind of a bootleg copy. I used to go to record conventions or record shows and buy all kinds. I used to have all these Beatles bootlegs and et cetera, none of which I have anymore, but luckily I held on to this. This is really fun. Highly recommended. Maybe, again, most stuff in the world these days, people are so lucky. You can find out about new stuff. If someone mentions something, boom, you look it up on the internet or on YouTube and you can find out information about it. That definitely wasn't the case when I was growing up. It's neat to see people who are, so young being able to be turned on and follow the links from. It's like they're going through the growth that I went through over 10 years, except they're able to go through, these phases in like 6 weeks. It's mind-boggling. Obviously, there's a lot to follow up on, and just listening to something doesn't, make it, have its deepest connection in your brain until you've gone through certain emotional changes, etc. I remember the first time I tried to read T.S. Eliot, I just didn't get it. Just did not compute to me. I think I might mention that in another one of my videos. But anyway, as we all grow older and change, we're able to appreciate different things that we couldn't at earlier stages. Now, the next thing I'm going to show, which is my favorite Beatles solo project, my favorite John Lennon album. It's his first album, Plastic Ono Band. There's Yoko and John, and there's John as a boy, and there's a Yoko Ono Plastic Ono Band album, where their two positions are inverted, and of course it has a picture of Yoko on the back, which I have also. But anyway, this is a very powerful, very emotionally bare and open album. John was going through primal scream therapy at the time and dealing with, the loss of his mother after being essentially abandoned by his mother and father when he was a boy, raised by his aunt. And then she died tragically shortly after they had reconnected. And he's going through that loss, and, that obviously left deep wounds on him. I think John eventually communicated briefly with his father after the Beatles became world-renowned, but he didn't really want to have anything to do with them. There was basically nothing left between them. Anyway, this is just a very powerful, emotional album. You can't listen to it all the time, but it's just a great thing. It doesn't have the kind of diversity in a way that some of the Beatles stuff, the musicality is focused just on getting out these feelings that he has. It has some softer parts and some louder parts, but not you don't hear anything psychedelic, for example, in this, really. There's not that kind of variance. One of the great things to the Beatles is, there'd be a John song, a Paul song, a George song, and that made it sort of an interesting mix. Another album that I want to focus on here is one that, again, sort of falls through the cracks for a lot of Beatles fans. And that's the Men Love Avenue collection, which came out after John's death by a few years. The thing that I think is so great about this is it takes two distinctly different sessions, the rock and roll sessions and the Walls and Bridges sessions, and it strips them of their production that they had that was so tied in with the time in which they were recorded. This is the bare essence of these songs. From the song Here We Go Again, which gives you sort of a feeling of John going through his long lost weekend that he described his time without Yoko. He was taking drugs and drinking too much and being sort of a jerk. It was just sort of a dark time for him. To Walls and Bridges. These stripped down versions of Steel and Glass, Scared, Nobody Loves You When You're Down and Out. These songs are just so much more powerful, I think, on these versions than they were on the Walls and Bridges versions. That sounds, this sounds like it was recorded in the 70s, whereas these seem very timeless to me in the way they sound without the extraneous, horns and production that were in those versions. Anyway, I think this is a great thing that a lot of Beatle fans maybe have missed along the way. Anyway, so those are the 5 that I would choose. Obviously, it's really hard to do. There's so many other great things out there. I have some real gaps in my Beatles solo project knowledge. I haven't heard that much of the McCartney stuff that's really done that much for me. I like some of the singles. I have, let's see, the Only 16 or whatever it is, single by Ringo Starr. I always thought that was a fun song, although it sounds a little, And as far as George, I like some of All Things Must Pass. And I recently got the Concert for Bangladesh, which I haven't listened to yet, which I'm looking forward to checking out. But again, like I said, I was much more interested in the what John Lennon was saying by far than the other Beatles in their solo work. Much more related to his point of view. Anyway, I'm really glad to be a part of the VC, and thanks if you made it this far. Peace out, everybody.